There are a lot of clues about Alzheimer's. I think there's enough clues for us to understand what is actually causing the cognitive impairment. Often these clues come from very disparate fields. The shingles vaccine, there was a group in Wales where if you were born after this cutoff date, you were eligible for the vaccine. And if you were born just before, you were not. They basically stratified those patients and followed them over time. And they found that people that had the shingles vaccine were 20% less likely to develop Alzheimer's or all-cause dementia within 7 years. Why? We have no idea. And that's because, again, these are very distinct fields of science that don't interface with each other directly. So with these LLMs kind of taking off, can we basically get very smart scientists to train these models to approximate some heuristic that they use, and then just deploy these on the knowledge graph of science to try and connect dots? That seems really tractable. And we have more than enough clues to figure out the perfect target for something like Alzheimer's or other diseases.
Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Sacha Schermerhorn, and he is the founder and CEO of Babylon Bio. They are currently trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's. I think over the last many decades, tens of thousands of people have been basically working on a cure for Alzheimer's. Billions and millions of dollars have been spent, and almost no progress has been made. What about that got you excited?
So I would actually disagree with the premise that the no progress has been made. I think a lot of progress has been made, but by showing us things that don't work more than things that do. So there's no existence proof that this is attainable, which to me is extremely exciting. And I think, the past several decades of failure have given the perception of intractability. And if you were to take the second order implication of that intractability, I think it's super interesting because it actually makes it a more tractable problem to go after. If everyone else thinks it's a graveyard, that to me at a meta level is obviously fertile grounds for actual innovation. I mean, I think we've kind of still looking at this disease through the prism of Dr. Alzheimer from 1906, which is definitely a good thread we should talk about because he had a crazy story. But this is, we are kind of focused on two pathologies. We have no idea kind of how they're related, but I think we've had enough clues in the clinic and on the diagnostic side and prognostic side to understand that, a little more parts of the picture that, maybe the field hasn't updated their OS on.
Do you want to just go through some of the approaches that have been tried and why they didn't work?
Yeah. All right. Let me actually start with the Dr. Alzheimer thing because it's crazy and it's a very good backdrop. So Dr. Alzheimer was this dude from way back when. He was born in the late 19th century. And got super interested. Well, first of all, his degree, his medical degree and his research during that was on earwax. So started in the world of earwax and was kind of lost, kind of just a roaming intellectual, not really, hadn't set his sights on anything yet. But he got when he was doing, I think it was his residency, he was got introduced to August Demeter, who was a patient who was in her late 50s, I believe, and had this disorientation, discombobulation, general cognitive impairment. People thought she was crazy. People didn't know what was going on. Maybe she had a mind virus. And anyway, spent a long time with her, characterized her very well clinically. When she eventually passed, he ended up doing histopathology on her brain. And he found these two, he used basically some variant of a silver stain, which was a way to visualize these proteins in her brain. And he was punched in the face by these two extremely large structures that shouldn't have been there. And it was what he called plaques at the time and neurofibrillary tangles inside of certain neurons. And obviously the right conclusion from that was, if this is not in a healthy brain and is present in the brain of a patient with what was then to be called Alzheimer's, these are clearly causing the symptoms that she had. Anyway, he ended up giving a talk, I think it was in Frankfurt, and it was a big seminar in front of all these people. And he presented the first case of Alzheimer's, what was then to become Alzheimer's. He was expecting a standing ovation, absolute crickets. People walked out in the middle of it.
They just
took their bathroom break. They didn't care at all. They came back to the next presentation to a completely packed house, which was on chronic masturbation. So that was about summarizes, the level of respect that he had. He kind of died, a bit of a, I don't want to call it a scientific pariah, but he didn't get the credit he deserved.
Like any good scientist, he basically did some really good research and then no one cared in his time.
Yes, basically. It's just such an insane, the following, they kicked him off stage, basically no follow-on questions to hear this fabled talk on chronic masturbation. So anyway, and then fast forward, I think the field really rightfully was saying, well, these things are not present in a healthy brain. Let's get rid of them. And that was many decades of research. Yeah, the craziest thing is like we eventually had data to suggest that we finally had these drugs that were able to reduce amyloid in the brain. The amyloid plaques the plaques are made up of a thing called beta amyloid, and that's was supposed to be this incredibly toxic thing. And the reduction of these, you can basically deplete this in the brain of an Alzheimer's patient and have relatively de minimis efficacy. And aducanumab famously reduced amyloid PET. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it was 76%, and had no impact on cognition whatsoever.
Isn't the amyloid cascade basically what people have spent, I don't know, roughly half of Alzheimer's research and dollars have been spent on?
That seems like a fair approximation, 100%. Yeah. I mean, this is a huge, like, it has been the dogma over many decades. And, my kind of like hot take within the Alzheimer's space is like, amyloid, because people have basically seen that, hey, we reduce amyloid, has relatively trivial efficacy in patients. Therefore, it seems reasonable to conclude that that's actually like we've debunked the hypothesis, but I actually think that's wrong. And I think, a lot of the biomarker development over the past like 15 years even has revealed that amyloid starts depositing in the brain 20 to possibly 30 years before you develop symptoms. And so that preclinical phase is like, clearly amyloid is causative and it's necessary, but it may not be sufficient. And eventually after 20 to 30 years, you develop this, like you transition into the clinical phase. And so like, if you were to go into a burning house, it doesn't matter what started the fire, right? It doesn't matter if it was a match or a toaster or whatever.
It is on fire.
It's on fire. So like you should put it out, right? And you should figure out clever ways of doing so. And I think that's where the field, maybe has like, lagged a little bit behind, is like not updating their priors that like the cause is actually not the thing that you need to target. Like if you're developing a drug, you should probably not go after the cause unless you want to run a 30-year trial, which like it already costs quite a pretty penny anyway. So you want to keep them as small as possible. But.
So if you're not going after the cause, what are you going after?
So I think there's like many ways to tackle that problem. I think, the thing that we spent a very long time thinking about, and like I personally have thought about quite a bit, was this like transition period. Like, how do you basically have this dormant stage for 30 years, and all of a sudden you wake up and you start forgetting your, where your keys are, and that leads to this cascade. And it's just become abundantly clear that phosphorylated tau is definitely a linchpin in that process. And so the thing that Dr. Alzheimer kind of conceived of as these neurofibrillary tangles actually turn out to be like the number one predictor of the onset of cognitive impairment. So they're not the predictor of whether you'll develop Alzheimer's, period. Amyloid is like a very good marker to suggest early kind of development. But if you look at the AUCRC of like all the biomarkers you could imagine, there's a thing called p-tau 217, which is a fragment of these tau tangles that proves to be the most predictive of when you'll develop Alzheimer's. I should say the cognitive impairment phase. Yeah.
For you yourself, like, why did you kind of make this the thing that you wanted to work on for the next like 25 plus years?
I think like it was a parallel track of these two things. I basically, I was very excited on the scientific side. I was, very big reader when I was growing up. And I was kind of like a music and art kid and not really into science. And then when I was about 13, I was also a big troublemaker, stole a book from my library, my middle school library, on neuroplasticity. It was called The Brain That Changed Itself by Norman Doidge. And I just like, horrible kid. Yeah. I was just like absolutely engrossed by this thing. I mean, I devoured the entire book, and the top guy that they talked about was this guy, Michael Merzenich, who was like the godfather of cortical plasticity. He was the first one to really show that your brain can rewire itself in these fundamental ways. And so I emailed him just being like, I found out he was in San Francisco, where I grew up. I emailed him, no response, and like, just bombarded him basically until he finally met with me. We stayed in close touch. And then when I was about 15, I started interning with him, working, happened to be on Alzheimer's. And around the same time, my grandmother had gotten diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I think just like, as I progressed on the research side and like went to college, was doing a lot of research there, and seeing these like what I conceived of as these breakthroughs in the lab, and seeing the incongruity with like that and my grandmother having not a single drug. This was pre-lecanemab, pre-aducanumab, all these other drugs that came out. And that just like crystallized my desire to eventually do something. I felt angry, to say the least. let down.
What kind of gave you the conviction that this was a solvable problem? If people have been working on it for decades and it hasn't been solved, that's, you know, a very big hurdle.
As I spent a lot of time asking pretty fundamental questions to these very, very, very top people who I respect tremendously, by the way. They like set the stage for a lot of really important research. I mean, even in the first like 7 months of Babylon, I probably met with 500 people. I was flying all over the world, cold emailing every single person. I'd read papers. You know, I was reading maybe 10, 15 papers a day, emailing all the authors of the papers I thought were good, and just going down that rabbit hole. And I would just ask these very basic questions. You know, why do you think tau fibrils are toxic? No answer, no answer. And again, I don't blame them. There was not enough information for us to be able to have these answers, but it just felt like there were enough of these like, axioms of this disease that we just like had not yet characterized. And that gave me a lot of confidence. That was the part of the reason I got into neuroscience to begin with, was like the fundamental pillars of this entire field aren't even there.
Yeah.
It's fertile grounds for innovation or discovery. That's super exciting.
And on that, like when you were kind of coming up to speed on how everything worked, like what was your process for doing that?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think like, I think a part of it is just like constantly challenging your priors. And like, one of the benefits, I suppose, like it was a luxury that I was afforded that I had not been in the field for 20, 30, 40, whatever years. Like I was this young, kind of, very, very, very hungry to learn kind of guy. And like, I was always asking questions, always willing to update my priors. I'd say like there were certain points where I was almost myopically focused on very specific biology that I thought was relevant. And then, I'd go deep enough down the rabbit hole, realize it's not, zoom back out. And there was no ego in that process. It was kind of like, obviously I'm going to be wrong. Like definitionally, like, even like the term Alzheimer's expert for me is like almost oxymoronic. If there were real experts in the Alzheimer's space, I think we would have we'd have a lot more answers. Yeah, I think just realizing that like no one was an expert, and then that I was in a unique position to just like, rewrite how I think about this disease from the ground up was like a pretty compelling prospect.
You basically have talked a number of times about updating your priors. What kind of paths have you gone down in the past, just over the past couple of years, where you thought that there might be something, some nugget of gold at the end of the tunnel, and then realized that's just the wrong direction and turned around?
Okay, so like I got really obsessed with axon degeneration for a while, and thinking that was the cause of Alzheimer's, specifically the cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's, and that was a very deep rabbit hole. I met all the people who published the seminal papers there, and I still think it's incredibly compelling. I think sometimes you'll kind of hit a dead end insofar as it relates to the druggability of that pathway, and so for that work, it was very compelling. A lot of evidence showing that the rate of cognitive decline, meaning the slope of your decline once you actually become symptomatic, that varies significantly as a function of specifically what are called white matter hyperintensities in these long range tracts in the brain. And I went very deep. And I just realized, druggability of that pathway was just really hard. There were no drugs that people had developed to actually intervene in that pathway, and doing it de novo would have been like, that's like a 10-year academic project, let alone then transition into something that you could have approximated a drug. So yeah, I think there were a lot of these. I mean, honestly, our first program for Alzheimer's we worked on, I still think the biology is really compelling. It was a completely novel target that no one had ever, tried drugging. And we got really excited about some of the biology there. And, in the end, we basically found that we knew the biological risk was like the highest percentile you could imagine. But the kind of like druggability ended up being in the first percentile. And that was just a really bad quadrant for us to be in. And so we pulled the plug. But I still think that's like a super exciting protein, just a bad target for Alzheimer's.
There's been a huge amount of capital deployed into trying to solve Alzheimer's, and it hasn't happened. How did you kind of structure the way that Babylon operates so that you can actually get to a point where you're able to solve it?
I think the first program gave me scar tissue that if you like, Alzheimer's is such a hard thing that any individual program, it cannot be existential for the company. If you're a single asset company trying to go after Alzheimer, just like, definitionally a moonshot is something where
like you're almost certainly
to fail, right? And I think like, it had me thinking a lot about like ways to kind of hedge against that, because you don't want to scale down the ambitions of what your goal is, obviously, in favor of like, increasing the POS. But at the same time, you need to be realistic about like, no one's gonna, just I mean, I'm not Elon Musk. I can't go raise tens of billions of dollars tomorrow. So I think like, to really, you have to get creative around that problem. And, it had me going very deep down the rabbit hole of like portfolio theory and like ways to kind of like hedge against this at the portfolio level. And, like more updates to come in the future there. But like, I think just financializing the process of self-financing Alzheimer's moonshots, that's something we've tried to be super thoughtful about. And, the goal is just to amortize the risk of those moonshots basically, and come up with clever ways to do so.
Are you able to go into any of those?
All right. Like, I mean, I think at the highest level, there are a lot of opportunities out there that are not per se like venture exit size. And when I say opportunities, like in the context of the pharma land, like I'm talking about drugs. And so there's a lot of drugs sitting on the shelves that like, Roivant obviously, famously kind of spearheaded this, where they were like, there are these multi-billion-dollar blockbusters, but you have to de-risk them significantly through several successive stages to get them to the inflection point that warrants that acquisition size. But I think like there's actually an even larger number of these like assets where it's not going to be a multi-billion-dollar exit, but like low 9 figures for sure. Is that something that, I think people should dedicate their lives to doing? Like, absolutely not. Or maybe if that's your objective function. But for us, if that went back onto the balance sheet, like the thought experiment was basically like a lot of those drugs, if that could go straight back onto the balance sheet instead of getting circulated up back to the investors, sorry to the Babylon investors, then, that's an amazing way for us to kind of like, again, financialize this process and self-fund, so that by the time we have a drug on the market for Alzheimer's, that, we were able to take it all the way through end to end without needing to kind of partner up at the very last stage, right? Like, how shitty would it be to run a marathon and, you're 3 feet away from the finish line, and then you have to, hold hand in hand with a second place who was, 10 minutes behind you. Like, that would just feel super defeating. And so we don't want to give 50% of our drug or whatever at the very finish line, just because we ran out of money or we weren't able to take it through or what have you.
The way I think about it is it's almost like a complex way of creating a new Google search, where you just have this like huge cash cow and you're able to siphon all the cash from it into the research angle.
Sure. Yeah. Commercial intermediates are like things that I think people who are thinking on like founders specifically who are thinking on a long time horizon should be very thoughtful about.
I remember Viagra at one point was like a heart medication, and then someone realized that there was another application for it. And so they repurposed it, and now it's worth, billions of dollars, I think, a year.
Yeah.
How many drugs are like that out there that you have already, the research has already been done and you can just repurpose them for another use?
For another use, it's not as simple as the mechanism of action is, I think, oftentimes like conceivably targeting the same target. So like, most molecules have a single target, and that target is hopefully the thing that like elicits the salubrious effect if you target it. And so the idea that like that same target, for instance, like sildenafil, which is Viagra, targets, I think it's a phosphatidylserase 4 inhibitor, but that target alone actually is relevant for Alzheimer's, which is super interesting. Like, totally makes sense, because it's like proliferative in nature. It actually leads to like, cell outgrowth and neurite outgrowth, and like these are very good things in the context of Alzheimer's, where you're getting this degeneration and you're actually stimulating regrowth. And so there was actually a study that, to close that point real quick, it does not mean that the PK itself, like the pharmacology of the drug, may be totally different. Maybe it doesn't even get into the brain. So whereas it could conceivably be efficacious by targeting the same thing, it's not going to actually get into the brain. So I guess that's my like non-answer, avoidance of your question. Like, I don't know what the exact number really is and what the like Fermi estimate of that would be, but like I have to imagine there's probably high hundreds of those opportunities out there where it would actually be a very good drug for the other thing. But probably the super majority of those are just like off patent and like there's no market there for you to actually advance it. But I will say, in the context of sildenafil, which is Viagra, I think there's a very interesting story, which is there was a study that basically did look through electronic health records, and the goal was like look through the prism of epidemiology, see if you can see these trends, and then like use that as a repurposing angle. And so they found that people who took sildenafil were 69% less likely to develop Alzheimer's. It was all cause dementia, but then people who did not. And this is like I mean, it's just, the number alone is hilarious that Viagra, reduces your risk by that number. But the overall was, the conclusion was that, okay, well, Viagra should be repurposed for Alzheimer's. Follow-on studies were not able to reproduce it. There's probably some like bias in terms of people who take Viagra need to have, healthy hearts. Healthy hearts probably better, overall, like antihypertensives are also good for Alzheimer's. So like long-term, that's probably what happened there. But still, I just think there's a lot of these like provocative stories out there, and there's an AI element to that as well we can get into if you're interested.
Yeah, I'm down.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think like there was an information scientist called Don R. Swanson, who did this thing called Swanson linking, which was like his whole thing was basically that there are a lot of medicines out there that can basically be discovered just based on information we already have, not new information that we need. And I'm like totally in on that concept. I think it's like, in the graph theory formalism of it, it's like you don't need to add a new node to the network to feel like, that will unlock new biology that you can drug. It's like there's probably a lot of medicines out there that can come from just drawing edges between pre-existing nodes. And so he took that to the max. And this was like at a time where information gathering, scraping, all these things were like super analog. So like kudos to him. But there was a few examples of like magnesium and migraine. But the big one that he did was for a thing called Raynaud syndrome, where he basically saw that Raynaud syndrome was linked to blood viscosity, and that blood viscosity was also linked to fish oil. And so, he therefore posited that fish oil would be a good intervention to intercept or remediate the Raynaud syndrome blood viscosity issue. And, that was like a big paper that I believe did ultimately prove to be efficacious. So I think there's a lot of these. And I think LLMs have unlocked a new ability to actually be able to do that in high throughput. It's definitely something we've been exploring. We'll see if it bears any fruits, but I'm very bullish on that general concept of just like A is connected to B, B is connected to C, therefore A is probably connected to C. Yeah.
Is there any other like neurodevelopmental or like neurodegenerative diseases that are able to kind of be cured in the process of trying to solve Alzheimer's?
Oh, interesting. If you believe that phosphorylated tau and tau fibrillation is like causative for the cognitive impairment in Alzheimer's, which I certainly do, then absolutely. There's like other tauopathies where that's the predominant pathology, because part of the problem with Alzheimer's is, yes, it's tau pathology, but it's also amyloid pathology. It's also neuroinflammation. Like there's a litany of different things going wrong in the brain, as you could imagine. And so it's much harder to kind of isolate the thing that is very much causative. On the other hand, you have like frontotemporal dementia, you have Pick's disease, PSP, these other things where they are what are called tauopathies. And that's like the predominant pathology in all of those is tau fibrillation. Yes, it's definitely conceivable that like, depending on how you target tau, that could be efficacious in other diseases that are also rare and can also get accelerated approval and things like this. And there's definitely companies out there doing that. But yeah, oftentimes like for something like Alzheimer's, if you have a rare disease where you have 100% chance of developing the pathology and, going into this neurodegeneration, I think you'd be fine with like, you have a much higher tolerance for toxicity. You have probably, a lot of these drugs are intrathecal, so they have to inject into your spine basically.
Which I imagine is like a high bar or barrier to doing it.
For sure. And so, but people are trying this directly in Alzheimer's. There's a drug called BIIB080 from Biogen and Ionis, and it's a tau ASO, and that's intrathecally delivered. And so, I mean, I don't know, imagine giving your grandmother, a spinal injection. It just,
you have to do this like multiple times?
Multiple times. Yeah.
Okay.
Dosing will vary. Eli Lilly has a tau siRNA as well. That's like similar thing, just intrathecal. And I think these things will be really important proof of concepts and like an existence proof that you can actually really stop progression of Alzheimer's. Because I do think we'll see the best efficacy so far. Like that's my prediction for this year is BIIB080 is going to be the most efficacious drug for Alzheimer's yet. The readout is slated to be in May of this year, but I have a strong suspicion it'll be like probably Q4, just because recruitment's really hard for things like that. People drop out because again, they don't want to keep coming back and getting a spinal injection, but I think it'll be a maybe not an amazing drug, but it'll definitely be an amazing proof of concept.
And for the drugs that have shown to be somewhat efficacious for Alzheimer's, what's been the process for actually developing those?
Okay, so rightfully so, people, as kind of mentioned previously, were going after this like beta amyloid because that's the thing that's the most present or kind of salient pathology in the brain of an Alzheimer's patient. Um, and so monoclonal antibodies are a good modality because they're highly specific. If they're like humanized, then like, there's no foreign agent that you're introducing into your body. So there's no, minimal likelihood of getting an immune reaction, things like this. And so, the benefit of these antibodies is they get to where they need to go very efficiently. Well, more on that in a second, but they are highly specific and highly efficacious once they target the protein. The problem is 0.1% of the antibody that you put into your body will actually get into your brain because there are these massive entities that are trying to be shuttled across the brain. And so the first generation of these were like, the first drug. So like Alzheimer's field had memantine in 2003, which was like basically a symptomatic treatment. 19 years later, you had aducanumab. And so it was like nothing for 19 years. And then aducanumab, which was considered a breakthrough. Biogen famously and later infamously put this on the market despite not showing any cognitive improvement in these patients. And reversed, FDA AdCom had, I think it was 14 people on the panel. 0 of them approved it. All of them rejected, but it was submitted anyway. There's a whole nother conspiracy around that. We'll save that for, people can Google that if they're interested. But yeah, it had an amazing job at removing these plaques, absolutely no efficacy. And the later generations got better and better. So lecanemab, which now is marketed as Leqembi, and then donanemab, which is now marketed as Kisunla. And the latest one that I'm most excited about is a thing called trontinemab, which actually hijacks a shuttle, the transferrin receptor in your brain. So you have the blood-brain barrier, which is protecting things from coming in, which makes sense. You don't really want anything that's going into your body to go straight into your brain, especially pathogens. But this is basically hijacking that shuttle that allows for this active transport into the brain, and it increases significantly the amount of antibody that can get in there. And so trontinemab has like the best efficacy in terms of amyloid clearance ever. And I'm like super excited about that one, especially a subcutaneous formulation, because again, going in every other week or every month to get an IV. I hate needles generally, but like an IV going into an infusion clinic, like when you're 7 years old, I don't know, it's tough.
Yeah, I remember my sister getting shots as a kid, and it was like the worst experience. She was just like horribly crying and stuff, and she really, really hated it. She had like PTSD from getting any shots for the first like 18 years of her life. And that was a very big barrier.
I just had to get my blood drawn yesterday. I almost passed out.
Really?
It's my biggest fear in life.
Yeah. I had a blood draw where they took like 28 vials of blood in one go.
Was this like one of these health wellness things?
This was, it was like a full blood panel. And that was pretty rough. I definitely almost passed out and threw up.
I believe you.
From that. So when you started this company, you've been at it for about 3 years. What was kind of the first few months or year like? What did you decide to go after?
Excruciating for sure. I mean, to be fair on the investors, I was going out pitching, I basically was telling people, we're going to go cure this undruggable disease. I don't have a PhD. And I know there's all these failures, but like, trust me, bro. And by the way, it's just me in my bedroom in New York. Line up. And it was so hard to raise money. I mean, like literally no one took me seriously. People were laughing at me. People, fell asleep during calls. I had 3 people fall asleep during calls, like in the middle of calls. People would hang up after 5 minutes. It was like really, really brutal. I'm glad I can laugh about it now because it was like, it was just hilarious. Like I just kept like chewing glass and I was like, it just became a game at a certain point. It's kind of like, and I had so much conviction in what I was doing. I was self-financing all the experiment. It wasn't like I was going to stop any of the experiments. So paying for everything personally, I think similar to you, just like credit score, like into the toilet. But yeah, it just made a lot of sense. And like, I wouldn't do it any other way. And I'm super grateful for that because it just like, probably just crystallized the like general, I'm incredibly strict on the finances. We're relatively, very lean by most comparisons, I would say. And yeah, a lot of that just was birthed from like the pain of paying for, everything with my personal credit card, or like, we do a high throughput screen and they'd be like, hey, please send your, have your CFO send a PO and like, for the $59,000 wire. And I was like, do you take credit card? Yeah. So it's like,
Did you put a $59,000
no,
wire on a credit card?
I ended up wiring it directly from my savings, but yeah, it was,
Did you have a lot of money to start this or not really?
Not really. I would say like, there was a brief period of like, software ventures that I did. And one of them became lucrative enough that it gave me the liquidity to do it. But I mean, I for the most part have been paycheck to paycheck, like literally since starting the company, because I put all of that into that was like the pre-seed money of the company.
What was different about the story that you were telling back then? Because I know you kind of threw a whole bunch of no's and people falling asleep. I imagine that you realized that something about this, like if you want to get that money, you probably have to tell a slightly different story than you're telling in order to do that. What changed? What shifted?
It's funny. I think like, as someone who I'd like to pride myself on like updating my priors constantly, weirdly at the time I was relatively like stringent about this. Like I think there was like, maybe local fluctuations in terms of like I'd meet with the Boston investors and they'd be like, hey, your science is really cool, but like, who the hell are you? And like, why should we give you a penny? And so maybe I kind of like spoke a little more formally or tried to be a little more, present in the way that I thought was like necessary. I'm very glad that like, I equilibrated and like, I just went back to just being me. But yeah, I think like I was pretty strict about not like succumbing to that pressure, because I really wanted people who were going to join the mission for the right reasons. And if they were joining because they thought it was a very high probability thing or whatever, like that was not the right partner I wanted to have for the rest of my life. And so, thankfully, like Long Journey came in, they were the first ones to observe the same set of facts and be attracted to them versus like repulsed by like, maybe I won't name names, but like one of the people at Long Journey, when I told him about the life savings thing, he was like, that is awesome. And it was the first person who was not like, you're an absolute idiot. What are you doing? That's going to go to zero. It was someone who like actually saw the dedication and actually appreciated the fact that I was so committed. And so yeah, thankfully they came in, and, since then, thanks to the efforts of the team, like our fundraising has gone much more smoothly since then. That was the hardest round to ever raise. But yeah, I'm super grateful for it, obviously, in retrospect.
So if you have most people that you meet just immediately are basically turned off by, I mean, at least in the early days, the idea that there's this like super low probability bet that will require a ridiculous amount of capital to actually even have a like reasonable shot in like a huge amount of time, maybe like 10 plus years. Yeah. How did that kind of enable you to find and attract the right types of individuals to be supportive of the mission?
That's a very good question, because I think again, a lot of the advice I was getting from the more like, Boston biotech like archetypes was like, you need to work backwards from compensation. You need to go as high percentile as your burn allows you to. You need to, and they gave me all this advice about winning the great talent over with the amount of equity and whatever else. And it just did not sit well with me. I just was like, my goal is again to assemble a team of best in class people that are missionaries, not mercenaries. And that was also something where I felt I was getting constant external pressure to hire the right people. Thankfully, I was uncompromising in that. I was just really like so insistent on only hiring people who were going to work for the right reasons. I probably will not reveal my kind of like proxies for what ends up being very predictive of that. But I certainly am like, I've got a very long list of things that I'm looking for when I meet someone, and I don't do conventional like hiring processes or whatever. It's very like get to know the person over many, many months and see how they kind of fare. And be very sober with them about like, you're going to work your ass off. You're going to age much faster probably than you would otherwise. I'm not going to be able to pay you, more than anyone else. I
think that's actually a really good test, because a lot of like, especially here in Silicon Valley, a lot of the people that are getting hired that are really, really smart today are basically just getting ridiculously massive compensation packages. And I think it kind of sets the wrong tone for why are you even working here? Like, why are you working on this problem? Is it for, $20 million, or is it because you care about the thing?
I think the fact that you have seen a massive kind of exodus of a lot of really exceptional talent, or like the constant velocity of like people moving back and forth, like that's indicative enough of that model is actually like not the right way to go about this problem. And so I think to whatever extent you can kind of filter a priority for those kinds of people, you're in a much better position. At least if you're working on something, if we were a pure hedge fund or we're some whatever, like maybe it's a different story. But for me, thank God I was very insistent on this and very like, yeah, like it kind of like weirdly turns out that the best people on the planet just want to work on the hardest problems. And so, there was an early process of me trying to recruit these drug hunters. And when I'd go meet with like very talented people and I'd be like, hey, I'm going after Alzheimer's, they're like, sorry, Alzheimer's is just like, that's impossible. Like, good luck to you. Or they'd be like, hey, if you want my advice on anything, you need to start paying me 15 minutes into the meeting. And I was like, no worries, let's hang up here. So, I had to like filter through a lot of people. It took me a very long time. And then like one thing kind of flipped for me in terms of like the hiring process where I basically started looking for people that were just like the secret geniuses behind a lot of the success stories that I respected the most. And so one of them was, the example of that was a thing. So Biohaven was a company based in New Haven that licensed a drug from BMS called rimegepant, and it was a CGRP antagonist for migraine. And anyway, they sold it for, I probably shouldn't disclose a number, but a very low amount of money. And then after having a successful phase 3 and going on the market, they're bought by Pfizer for $11.6 billion. It's considered like one of the great successes in recent history in the neuro space. Mm-hmm. And so everyone was like celebrating the executives that kind of like took that forward. And to be fair, like Vlad Korich, who's the CEO of and founder of Biohaven, is like exceptional, world class. But I was more interested in the geniuses who, like the medicinal chemists who actually invented that molecule. And so I ended up reaching out to everyone on that patent, the composition of matter patent for rimegepant. I was most impressed with the lead inventor, John Makor. And again, I think like when I met John for the first time, I basically told him like, we're taking the biggest swing you can possibly take. This is like very, any individual program has a very low likelihood of success, but like my goal is to literally get like the Avengers of drug hunting, throw them in a room and just throw them at this incredibly meaty problem. And John was like, sign me up. I mean, there was not again, I think one of the proxies I look for is like the extent to which they'll negotiate, right? John could get paid way more than what he's getting elsewhere. And, we've been lucky enough to have him come out of retirement to be with us full time. And like, that was just a direct byproduct, not of the money, not of the equity, not of anything, but like because of the passion and the nucleation of talent that we've been lucky enough to have.
Money is definitely one factor for determining or figuring out rapidly whether or not someone is more missionary, more mercenary. But what have been the other biggest like indicators or signal for you over the past like 3 years that you've developed for figuring out whether or not someone's a missionary?
Okay. I will give one version of this, which is it's been very predictive. If someone is willing to just like jam with me on science and have no, it's not a formal hiring process. It's literally just like, hey, two people who are super passionate about this space. Let's just talk for hours, unscripted. Just like, are they willing to do that? And not only are they willing to do that once, but are they willing to do that like many, many, many times over many months? And for me, the people who are like the right people, at least for Babylon, are the ones who basically are so passionate about what they do. They do this for free. And like, the thought of getting paid is just like, sure. I mean, like it's a secondary kind of thing.
Like a byproduct of the thing, but it's
totally,
not
exactly
at all front of mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like, yeah, like, and it's so funny because it is almost like the midwit meme, but like, I've just found that like the best people in the world really are just so down to just chat science. The money is not what drives them. And there's probably like a skew towards like, something in there in terms of like, they have to have some financial stability, et cetera. But like, yeah, the best people in the world really just love what they do so much that they fail retirement multiple times. They're like in their 70s. They still just want to chat science with a random 29-year-old.
Retirement.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, John, I'm pretty sure has failed retirement like two times. Maybe this is the first time. No, but Bill at least has failed retirement a few times. And yeah, these guys are indefatigable. I mean, like, I've been super impressed with the stamina. Like it inspires me to work harder, seeing how much, how when they do the 12-hour days, when they're, sending me emails at 4 a.m. on a Saturday, like these are the kinds of things that for me, I just, they command the ultimate respect. Like late 60s, early 70s, still working that hard. Like they must really love what they do. And those are the kinds of signals I look for, at least.
Did this sort of process where you're really trying to optimize for these people that are working on the problem purely because they care about the problem, did you basically have any other approaches at the very beginning where you went in another direction because you initially thought that was the right mode of operation and then kind of worked backwards and said, no, this was a mistake, I'm going to go in a different direction?
I think there is like a really tough balancing act between, you may have acute needs that like you need to immediately reconcile. And like part of that is ends up skewing you towards just like compromising your standards in favor of like moving very quickly and plugging the wound, so to speak. And like, I'd be lying to say there haven't been like, examples of that. But overall, I think our hit rate is really high. And like part of it honestly started with Laura, who's our first hire. She's the founding scientist of the team. She's just an incredible workhorse and was like so just like dedicated from day zero. Like I met her, and to be fair, I think I'm audacious enough that like I'll have people do the work and see what happens. And so like first time I met her, and I was still in New York at the time, and I was super impressed. And I just said, the next day I was like, hey, I'm stuck in New York. I need you to start going to all these different labs that I'm looking at in San Francisco. And by the way, some of them are like 2 hours outside of San Francisco. And like, by the way, I don't really have money to pay you. Or I definitely didn't have money to pay her generally, but I definitely couldn't pay her to even get the Ubers, because all of my money was just like going straight to these experiments I was running. And so she just was like, okay, I guess sure. And she helped out as a friend for a long time, and then things kind of worked out. And when she was finished with her postdoc at UCSF, pulled her in full time. But like that kind of dedication, I think, set the stage for everyone else, and definitely like held my bar very high insofar as it related to future hires.
Keeping the DNA right.
Yeah, keeping the DNA right. And like it's like it almost feels platitudinous at this point when people say like, well, the first 10 hires will define like the rest of your company. But it's like, we're still super early days of Babylon. Like this isn't even chapter 1 in my opinion, but it is like I couldn't be more true. And I think just being like, culture can only be defined by what you're willing to fire for, in my opinion. And I just think, people are like very scared to do that, but in doing so, it's like an adverse selection for future hires, because if people feel like, oh, well, the bar is kind of like all over the place, like that's not going to hire the best people. And so I think just being super strict about that and uncompromising, even if you really like the person, is like really has been important for us, at least.
So Alzheimer's is something where there's very long feedback loops.
Yes.
And I think this is going into it, you recognize that this is like a multi-decade journey where there's not really a very clear end date. Or like, this is when we're going to solve it. How do you both maintain that very long-term view while also keeping your, foot on the gas as much as possible?
I think a huge part of why the team works so hard is because, again, like I've just filtered for that up front, and like, maybe this is ignorant, but I'm very much of the belief and have come to the realization that the supermajority of management problems are actually just hiring problems that are kind of masquerading as something else. And so, I don't have to like push the team to be working, from, early in the morning to late at night. Like that's a byproduct of the people that I've happened to have filtered for. And so I think like, the burnout thing is like, and again, like 3 years in, but like at least I personally have been working this way for pretty much my whole life. Like I think when you're just incredibly passionate about something, there's just like a infinite resource that you can tap into. And I think the burnout does come as a byproduct of like not having impact. So that definitely matters. And that's been said before, but like, yeah, again, like how are you able to get like a 67-year-old flying red eyes every other week from New Jersey and like working 12 hours a day? Like, I don't know. I think it's just like hiring for someone who is just built like that, right? Like Dario on our team is built different. Like he's a beast.
Sam Altman has talked about the idea of burnout in the past. And I think he basically said like work does not actually cause burnout. What causes burnout is losing.
Absolutely.
And if you're always winning and you feel like there's momentum, you never burn out.
Yeah. I'd probably like, fork that idea and put like a corollary to it, which is like maybe, but my revision actually of that would be that I think it's like a lack of agency that breeds burnout. It's actually not like losing. Because if you feel like you had agency over the decision and it blows up in your face, I still think like you internalize that differently than if something blows up in your face and it wasn't even like you had no control over the situation. So I think just like continuing to make sure that the team like, feels that agency over these things and like they're working super hard, but like they also are able to influence things like that probably really matters. And I think like that's also just a byproduct of keeping the team super small. Is like, the numerator will always be one. You're always just one human being, hopefully. But like keeping the denominator small just means that your contributions to the total like pool of activity is basically much larger when you have a small denominator versus a larger one. And I think that's why like a lot of really talented high agency people are leaving a lot of the like hyperscalers, is because they kind of like, irrespective of how talented they are, the denominator has gotten so large, their individual contributions, no matter how good they are, is just like de minimis in comparison to what it would be on a very small Delta Force team of like super talented people.
I've talked to a couple of people from SpaceX, and it's the same thing where, you know, if you have a single person at SpaceX, they may not have a huge impact on, you know, actually like moving the needle at that company, whereas they could take the same amount of action and have a much bigger impact working on their own product or problem.
For sure. Yep. Yeah. I definitely subscribe to that. Yeah.
I think Martin Shkreli talked about this, where he said there's just a whole bunch of, going back to this idea of there's a bunch of drugs that are out there that have already been synthesized or made, and they just haven't been properly like productized for the right disease. How have you kind of been able to figure out how to go through that search space and figure out which ones are worth going after versus not?
So my kind of like crazy vision for the future at this nexus is that this is like a conversation I've had with Jacob Kimmel from New Limit, and he really like influenced the way I think about this specific problem. But you know, John Makor, for instance, like on our team, like bona fide kind of like drug hunting genius, like his track record speaks for itself, but like you spend 20 minutes with that guy and you're just like, okay, he is like almost extraterrestrial. And I think like so John is let's say bandwidth constrained by his own biological compute. Okay, he's one entity, he's one person, he's like, you know, so could you get 1 million John Makors in a server room trying to find you medicines? Like, I think that's a really exciting prospect. Obviously, that's a great North Star. How do you get there? That's a separate story. But yeah, that's like something that I've tried being thoughtful about. And like, you know, I think part of constraining the search space is like just baking in really good priors, baking in really good heuristics, and like, yeah. So to whatever extent, you know, with our very small team, like we've been able to kind of do that. That's you know, that's something I guess I'll just say that's something we think about a lot, and like something we're building towards. And like, again, this is one of these card flips that's like not yet occurred, but I'm pretty sure will be like a really good investment.
The first time that I talked with Lotta, she mentioned that she didn't have a phone, and it really confused me. And then I realized that you also don't have a phone, and I think that you're the person that she got that from. And it's this idea of like eliminating distraction, I believe, and kind of eliminating the things that will make you be able to leave the actual office.
For sure.
How do you think about kind of eliminating distraction and just focusing on the thing that you're actually doing?
I think it's just like my lens here is pretty simple. Like, I look at life through the prism of life minutes. And
life minutes,
yeah. And if you're just like throwing away a third of your life, like waking life minutes, just like into the abyss, that's like probably like not net productive. And so yeah, it's like something I think about a lot is just like, you know, you have this, like, it's the one resource or currency that we're given in life, and like you have to deploy those resources meaningfully. So like, where do I want to deploy my life minutes? For me, the thing that I believe is the most important for just like my life trajectory is Babylon, and I want to kind of like increase as much surface area to that as possible. And so part of that is a distraction minimization. Another part of that is just like, you know, not feeling good existentially about this idea of just like throwing things into the abyss, like, you know. So yeah, I'd say like it's probably, it's been like about 3 years now, no cell phone. People are like, oh my God, how do you travel? How do you, like, if you're stuck somewhere, how do you get directions? I'm like, speak to a human, the same way we've been doing for millennia, right? Like prior to this. So like, it's a very recent phenomenon that's been like incredibly, you know, it's distributed itself so quickly that like now it feels impossible to imagine life without a phone. But it's cool. And like, honestly, at the least, like when I tell people like at the airport and I have them print out my ticket instead of like scanning a QR code, like it's nice because it actually, like, you can just like see like something, at least like some switch flipping somewhere in their brain of like, oh,
this person thinks a little bit differently.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But like also like, oh, maybe it's like not the thing that maybe it is not as necessary as, you know, I may have thought. And yeah, my life has been like significantly enriched as a result of it.
How did you make the decision in the first place?
I had a very complicated relationship with my phone always. Like in college, everyone always made fun of me because I had the oldest version. Like I had an iPhone 4 until 2019, maybe 2020. Like that was my whole thing. Because I think I just like saw the kind of like iteration rate, like people basically conflating change with progress as it related to the Apple products, and being like, oh my God, you know, now I have a new icon for my YouTube channel. And I was like, and there was actually a really sobering moment with the YouTube, like with the iPhone, where you used to be able to watch YouTube videos, which I'd like play music there, and I'd play a YouTube, like a song, close my iPhone, and it would still keep playing the music. And it was actually also a good hack to get around the ads. And then one day they pushed an update And now I had the red YouTube icon instead of the old like TV thing they had. And then I no longer could do that. And they got rid of that feature very intentionally. And I was just like, we've passed the inflection point where like they need to kind of appease us as customers, because the retention is just so amazing that like they can basically get away with whatever they want. And I think like, yeah, that just crystallized my like, these phones are like not trending in the right direction. So I started using like black and white everything. This was like 2016 probably at this point. And then, yeah, just like in college, hated my phone. And then eventually it just became a super easy decision when I started Babylon.
So you just mentioned off camera when we were talking that you think the information to cure Alzheimer's is already out there.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Okay. So, I mean, look, it's like, it's a crazy thing to say, but I think like, the amount of information that's like, let's call it the scientific literature that comes out every week that's like worth reading, relevant to whatever field, is like has far outpaced our ability to read, just like period, right? Like if you had a Nobel laureate trying to ingest papers every single week, like, okay, well, it's just like, it was intractable decades ago to even catch up on all the latest. So for me, the kind of like, taking that to the extreme, like if there's way more information than any individual can like, have to be able to like determine what
Synthesize.
the cure is, to synthesize, then like there's an emergence of these like the first kind of model that actually allows us to reliably, let's just say, ingest information in text space or like language space, then those two things together could probably be super powerful. So like there are a lot of clues about Alzheimer's. I think there's enough clues for us, like at the epidemiological level, molecular level, whatever, to understand what is actually causing the cognitive impairment. And so like, and they come like, often these clues come from very disparate fields. So like in the world of like, vaccine biology, it's like, okay, well, the shingles vaccine, there was a group in Wales in like, I think there were people born in the early 90s. That's gotta be before. But anyway, people born at a certain time, there was a mandate in Wales where if you were born after this cutoff date, you were eligible for the vaccine. And if you were born just after, just before, you were not. And so this was like, you basically stratified the entire like Wales population into two camps. And so people that were born within a week of each other, there's nothing different about them except that half of them got the vaccine, the other half did not. They basically stratified those patients and followed them over time. And they found that people that had the shingles vaccine were 20% less likely to develop Alzheimer's or all-cause dementia. It was actually all-cause dementia within 7 years. Why? We have no idea. And that's because, again, these are very kind of distinct fields of science that don't interface with each other directly. So all we know is like, the latent space of those observations. Like clearly there's something there. We don't have the common language to be able to interface with them. And so I've gotten super excited about this idea of like, this is something I've been toying with for years now, but like, with these LLMs kind of taking off, can we basically like fine tune these LLMs with our like best in class team or whoever, but like just get very smart scientists to train these models to approximate some heuristic that they use, and then just deploy these on like the knowledge graph of science to try and connect dots. Like that seems really tractable. And like, we have more than enough clues to figure out like the perfect target for something like Alzheimer's or other diseases.
You started working, I think, with OpenAI to basically try to design models that are super good at this. So how did that happen?
Yeah,
and what's the goal of that?
I mean, so it was like birthed from a conversation I had with their leadership around this topic, and it sounded like the OpenAI had been thinking very similarly along those lines. And so then from there, it became a question of like, if you want to fine tune models to just be better at particular tasks, the classic thing I always say is like, to calculate an objective function, you need to compute a delta. To compute a delta, in number space, that's like a minus b. It's a subtraction, very simple. In string space, that's Levenstein distance. In reasoning space, that's an unsolved problem. No one's really like cracked that yet. And so they were like, well, how do we kind of compare scientific hypothesis A with B if we want to train the model to get better and better at generating good scientific hypotheses? And so the calculus was pretty simple. It was like the closest thing we have to binaries in the world of biology is like clinical trial readouts. And it's not perfect, but it's the closest you can get, I think. And so we use that as a way to basically compute deltas to say like, okay, it either hit the primary endpoint or did not. And then that becomes like a yes, no kind of thing. And from there, you can compute a loss function finally in the world of biology and start trying to train a model to understand, how you can map from the world of biology to the world of clinical trial like outcomes. And my dream for that project was like, one day if we had a model that could reliably predict these outcomes, and say like, hey, we're going from the world of biology, now tell us what's going to work, that one day we can do the opposite and say, there was a successful phase 3 for Alzheimer's on this endpoint. What was the biology that we drugged? And I think that was a bit, idealistic, let's just say. Like in reality, that's not really, that wasn't a tractable path, but it's still something I think a lot about. But
What else with the kind of explosion of AI has been unlocked or has become made possible over the past couple of years that would have been impossible for the past 100?
I mean, it just makes like, I'm not going to say anything new here, but I just think generally like, search space is like, you can constrain the search space much more readily. And I think like not being bandwidth constrained in terms of like as humans, it's very hard for us to hold like many different things in context. And so, and models, LLMs are having that problem as well. But like, if you can kind of extract the like quantum of information that's relevant to you from, hundreds of papers, it like reduces the compute complexity, let's just say, required to like actually get information very quickly. So like if I have clue A like in my mind, and then I'm like, deploying these bots to kind of like retrieve relevant information, it's much easier for me to kind of like lay out on the table all the clues that I need to kind of like synthesize together in one basket, instead of the usual process, which is like, okay, I'm going to go read a paper. Oh, that's interesting. Let me now go read these like 10 other papers. Now let me go. You forget the first paper you read, but by the time you're done with like, a week of that investigation. So I just think it like your iteration loop is just much faster, and that's probably a good thing.
You talked about controversial science. Go into that.
All right. I just think it's super interesting when there is like a collision between like society and science, and like, what we as humans or society kind of like choose to do with that. And so, I think the proverbial example of this is like, there was a researcher in the early 90s called Simon LeVay, and I think it was 1991, he came up with what he dubbed to be the kind of neurological substrate of homosexuality. And so this was a thing called the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus. It was published in Science, which is like the top journal. And it was featured on Oprah and like, 60 Minutes maybe, all these things. And, he was expecting the Nobel Prize. And by the way, just specifically on the science, like what he actually found was that there's a small kind of nucleus of cells that is 2.8 times larger in heterosexual males than it is in homosexual males and women. And so there was like no delta between the latter two groups, but like a 2.8x multiple on in the size there on average. I think the N was like, it was like 40 plus people. And so there were a lot of critiques about the science, like, well, some of these, the homosexual men that were enrolled in this were, had a lot of them died of HIV AIDS, and like maybe that was a contributing factor or whatever. But for the most part, it was like just an observation. He was not saying what to do with that. And he's expecting the Nobel Prize basically. And instead he gets excommunicated from Salk. He joins some random, institute. He took a leave of absence. And 1 year later, he gets completely, like, he becomes the scientific pariah of the century. It's like, the left hated him because it gave a therapeutic target for sexuality. The right hated him because it validated homosexuality. And so you kind of had this like convergent pincer attack that just like skewered him basically. And so, since then he's been a kind of like roaming intellectual, and he's an amazing, researcher and all these things. But it was just so interesting that like when you have an incongruity between like, well, basic science should be in theory agnostic to these kinds of things within the bounds of some ethics, but like a discovery, someone should not be penalized for a discovery. He didn't say what to do with it or anything. And
he just literally showed like data.
He just showed data. Anyway, he's since been, more or less like, he's gone in the winds of scientific discovery. But the irony that I think is like just like so sobering is he's gay. He just wanted to understand his own sexuality. And so like, and again, I'm not like, without commenting on like the science itself of that biology, like it is really just like, and I don't even know what the right answer is there too. Cause it's like, I think, but it kind of giving a therapeutic target or a filter for things like sexuality, like that is like controversial. Same with gene editing, right? Like, should we put a moratorium on all CRISPR research just because you can gene edit babies? And like, some people think that's a bad thing. Like, I don't know, these are maybe not questions for the basic researchers who make the discoveries to answer, and probably the period just like goes there. Yeah.
There's this idea that like science and discovery kind of progresses one death at a time. How do you think about that in the sense of, if we're living longer, how do we kind of keep on pushing the envelope on science?
I think like, I think it definitely culls branches of scientific discovery. I don't think, I don't think if you imagine like a tree that like bifurcates constantly and like it's a knowledge tree and it's kind of like you have these different branches. I don't think the right way to increase the number of scientific discoveries is to like prune branches and reallocate resources into like ones that are currently bearing fruits. I think, long history of amazing discoveries coming from surprising places. And so, and this is part of by the way, the argument around like funding for the NIH and like, academic institutions, like, should we even still be investing in basic research, or do we just need to like concentrate capital in these other places? But yeah, no, I would definitely like reject the premise that like deaths are like, deaths of scientific inquiry or whatever are like the right way to go about things. I think, discovery obviously breeds further discovery. And so we should be like, whatever extent possible, pouring gasoline on the fire when we see that there's like a tiny little something there.
I noticed on your website, the first thing that you see is not like we're going to cure Alzheimer's. It's actually, we want to give more time back with your like loved ones in effect. I'm wondering what other things can you basically target in the process of trying to cure this specific disease? Like, let's talk about neurodegeneration. If you don't necessarily cure Alzheimer's, but you're curing other things that relate to it and like relate to neurodegeneration, you're able to give people more time with the people that they love. Is this something that you're thinking about where you're trying to target this specific thing, but over the course of doing that, you're going to find other cures and remedies for things?
I think it'd almost be hubristic for me to answer yes. Like, I think, is it, I think the process of like anyone kind of like pursuing a scientific path is that, kind of going back to the bifurcation of different branches, it's like there will be spin-off things that hopefully bear fruits on their own. And, the perfect instantiation of Babylon is one where the mission, it proves to be true, or like we're able to achieve that. Maybe like the secondary one is that we're able to plant several flags that, allow the field to kind of advance further. And so, yeah, from that perspective, I think like it's interesting. I think like the giving families more time with their loved ones, like that's like a super important prism through which to look at this problem, because you want more quality time. Like my grandmother had a really horrible final few years. It was not right for someone to go through that. And so to whatever extent we can kind of like, I think the longevity field generally is like, you have like people who are focused on health span and then people who just like want to increase the number of like total life years lived. And like, I'm definitely not in the latter camp. I think like
just like suffering for the last 20, but you live for
that
110.
is like exactly like that is just like obviously not good. Yeah, I think there's a human element to that kind of like, that statement as well, which is like, we think in the world of like molecules and proteins, and my team is like, always thinking through that lens. But I think an interesting kind of decision I made as well early on was like, for us to also get exposure to the other side of that, like go meet real human beings that are living with this disease. Like, we had a patient come in here the other day rather. And that was like, again, it's just such a like sobering thing to kind of see what's on the other side. And like volunteering at memory clinics, like these are the kinds of things where it's like, look, we're kind of going through the lens of like a pharmaceutical that will help these people. At the same time, there's like so much work you can do in the meantime, right? Like I often wonder this, that like, for all these companies that are spending billions of dollars on this, like, and ultimately they may fail to like have the cure for whatever disease they're going after. Like, would they have just been better? Like, would the kind of like AUC of like overall kind of benefit to humanity just been higher if they had just put like those hundreds of people to like, volunteer in these like community centers or whatever? Like, I don't know, like that's a provocative question, but like, yeah, it's like something that at least we're trying to do both.
Yeah, and on the like volunteering at memory clinic side, you have basically, I think every single week you bring your team and your like entire team to go work and like help at those clinics, and just try to like keep yourself close to the problem. How did you come up with that?
It's not the right cadence per se, but like, it's whenever they let us. But yeah, I think the calculus was like pretty simple. It's just like, we're working super hard. I'm always pushing my team. Like, the big joke in the company is like, what's Sacha's favorite timeline? Like, it's yesterday. And so like, I'm always pushing these timelines, always cranking, hard, and really trying to get the team to move with urgency. And I think you just like internalize that urgency so much more differently when you like see these people and you're like, man, like they deserve to live. Like you want to work harder to like give them the right, let them benefit from the eventual work if everything works out. And like, you know, I think the kind of thought experiment that I definitely try to have the team do is like, if you had a parent that like were suffering from this, or like you knew had 100% chance of getting this in 10 years, like, would you be able to live with yourself if you didn't work as hard as you possibly could to like, you know, prevent that eventuality? So yeah, I think it's just like, it's incredibly important. I think more companies should do this. And for us has been just like rewarding on all fronts.
On the distraction side, you are basically like trying to systematically eliminate all the distraction in your life that doesn't have to do with Babylon. How do you think about basically staying focused on the long-term mission while also basically doing all of these other things in the meantime in order to get there? So you have to go make a bunch of money. Like if you had a massive checkbook of $10 billion, maybe you can do, you know, a different set of steps. But because you don't have that, you have to go find those drugs and like, you know, do whatever you do with them.
Yeah, I think this applies in so many things, just like this meta level concept, but like 100%, I think the need for a commercial intermediate is almost something I quietly resent. Like, you know, in a perfect world, like, you know, again, someone would hand us like, you know, just a carte blanche to just work on this problem. And I mean, a true carte blanche. I think like we see a lot of companies that are incepted with like billions of dollars and like, you know, we'll remain those unnamed, but like there's a lot of these mega rounds that are happening now in the biospace, and you're seeing a concentration of capital into these certain companies, but you do not see that balance sheet be put to work. Like, I think the balance sheet is incredibly like the kind of like impact per dollar goes up, or like, let's call it the impact per dollar is inversely proportional to the number of like people on the team, because with a super small dedicated team of like extremely talented people, I'm pretty sure it's like better to give them the same amount of money than like a team that'll have hundreds of people immediately, because their balance sheet now allows them to hire all these people. And so, yeah, I think it's like time to bureaucracy is like much shorter if you were like incepted with $1 billion versus like you kind of have to, you know, fight your way up to the top. And you even see that with like a lot of companies that are started in downturns, like macro level downturns. Those, some of the most successful companies ever were started in economic, you know.
Do you think that model of getting a bunch of money right at the start, so like opening, you know, creating a lab and then just having, you know, like $3 billion or something, does that model even work, or does it basically create the wrong muscle memory for commercializing a drug and making that work?
I can't speak from experience. So I will say that I can definitely say that being very, very, very scrappy early on has just like been imbued into the DNA of the company. And like, I hope and pray that we will never not be as scrappy as we have been. I think it's like, it's been really, integral to how we do things at Babylon. And that was a pure byproduct of the early days where I had zero money and I was feeling that pain of like, again, just wiring those money for my life savings. That didn't feel great.
What like net results do you think are going to come from having that like scrappy DNA versus having a massive checkbook?
I think it's a forcing function to be a lot more thoughtful about like the decisions you make. And I think, like, by the way, I've done this to the extreme where like we've said no to a lot of things we should have said yes to, because I was just so like, no, it's like, it's too much money. It's too much money. And then 6 months later, I'm like, I really regret not doing that. So like, you know, thankfully it's been nothing that's like been actually like, you know, overall massively influential, but yeah, I think it just like, it forces you to be a lot more thoughtful, and then just generally like, again, it kind of hires for the right people. This is part of the reason we haven't even announced like how much money we raise or anything like that, is like, I just think it puts a big neon dollar sign above your head, and like it could just be a kind of bat signal for the wrong talent. And again, I don't want to like say that's the case because I've never been on the other side of it, but like, at least for us, it's been very good to just like not signal those kinds of things, because then it doesn't become an inclusion criterion for the people that we hire.
After having those situations where you basically say no and then you later realize that you made the wrong call, how do you kind of update your decision making going forward?
I definitely feel the pain on a very emotional level when I make a bad decision, and I internalize that pain. I think part of like, you know, there are a lot of things where like, you know, maybe our first default is to just be like, oh, well, I feel pain, that's a bad thing, therefore I should like not feel that. And obviously then there's like the second order thinking around that, which is like, hey, the pain is a good forcing function just to get better. And you need that as part of your gradient descent, right? Like you need to feel the pain of making the wrong decision. And so, yeah, I think I just like, you know, I really have those, like, I feel it on a visceral level when I made a bad decision, and I like sit with that. I don't try to reject it. I'm like, good. I'm glad that I feel the pain because it helps me, you know, informs the next decision I'll make. And yeah, I think it's just a process of kind of iterating on that.
What's your process for experiencing that pain and dealing with it?
probably not like, not one that's like optimal. I think I'm just generally like, I sit with it. I write a lot. Like I have like a Notion file, which is just like stream of consciousness. Like every now and then, if there's something where I'm like, oh, I got like a real gut punch, I will just like dump it out on the kind of screen so I can like read it back to myself, honestly, in the future. And I found that to be incredibly fruitful. Yeah, I've had a rolling document since day zero of the company, and it's just like my stream of conscious thoughts at all these different points in our company. And
do you feel like after you have one of those setbacks and then you write it out, you're able to kind of work through it in a better way?
Yeah, that's for sure. And I would say like, the other thing is having almost like internal proxies to like, it's really hard to know where you are at in terms of like your growth rate. And so I think you need to like look for these external signals that can give you a sense that you're in like a high first derivative kind of situation. And so the my proxy for this is like time to last embarrassment. And like, if you were like, if you need to look back 2 years, like in your records to be like, oh, I'm really embarrassed that I like thought this way, or that I like wrote that thing, or like spoken that way, like that's probably like way too long. And if you're really embarrassed by like even the way you were like thinking about a problem or like speaking, generally like 2 months ago, I think that's like you're in a high first derivative kind of environment. So like that to me is definitely my proxy. I'm constantly looking back and just being like, oh God, I can't believe I was like so juvenile in my way of thinking about this. I'm sure I'll say the same thing about this interview in a few months. And I hope that's the case, right? Like I kind of want to constantly be checking myself on these things and updating accordingly.
I would almost say that the how often you're being embarrassed is, or you're embarrassed by the way that you were thinking before, or the actions that you took, is kind of a proxy for the amount of risk that you're taking at any given moment. Yeah. And so if you're taking no risk and you're not changing anything anywhere, then you're probably not embarrassed at all because you don't even realize.
Zero. Totally.
How do you think about risk taking and like deciding what risks are worth taking?
That's a good question. I put it in context with the rest of the stuff that we're doing. So like, again, at the pipeline level, when we look at the assets that we're working on, like it is, nothing can be taken. Like these things are not Poisson in their distribution. Like they are very much beholden to each other. And so if I'm like, I know when we're stretched very far in the risk dimension because I'm internalizing it constantly. And then we have to hedge against that by, having another thing. It's not like a very mathematical formalism of like portfolio theory, but it is like how I think about just even the portfolio of different decisions I'm making on any given time is like, I think if we've overextended ourselves, like just financially in the past like week, let's call it, I'll be very conscious of like the future deployment if I don't see an ROI in the like, within a month or whatever. So yeah, I think it's just like spending a lot of time just internalizing these things, feeling like at a visceral level. Like I think that's like a underrated thing is like if you're deleting all inputs except your company, you just like internalize things almost somatically, like differently. And so yeah, your intuition will like hopefully like give you a gut check, like a gut check on like, hey, we've overextended ourselves.
How is your intuition kind of updated over time as you gathered this new information?
I don't know. I don't know. I think, I'd like to think that, I try to like take stock of like times where I've been like really like strongly like this is going to happen and I've been wrong. Like those large deltas in like confidence and outcome is like, those are really rich with information. Yeah. And it just comes back to logging it, right? Like you just like have a
journaling
Notion.
Moments.
Yeah. Like just like literally dump that into Notion. Like, man, I was so sure this was going to work and it didn't, or like the other way around.
How often does that happen?
Hopefully like, less frequently over time. I'd say in the early days, it was like once every few months. And like now I don't remember the last time. I have to dig up my notes. Yeah.
Let's just talk about like what causes cognitive impairment over time.
In Alzheimer's, I mean, I think like, the answer is we don't know. It's obviously not unknowable, but we just like, we don't yet know. I think like on like a biological or like molecular level, like what I think is going on is that, my favorite question to ask Alzheimer's people is like, why are tau fibrils toxic? And tau fibrils, so like we know that amyloid starts depositing 20, 30 years before symptoms. Eventually that starts to lead to the hyperphosphorylation of tau. And that hyperphosphorylation of tau ends up leading to the detachment of tau from microtubules. And then like tau fibrillizes and it causes neurodegeneration. And like that final link is just like a huge question mark. And so my like crazy theory that was really like the birth of Babylon was that basically these, tau is like a relatively like disordered protein that like forms a very specific structure when it fibrillizes, which just means it basically binds to itself. And you know, maybe a note to the editor that you should look up 6HRE in the protein database, and like that, you know, you can display that up on the screen. But it's like basically it looks like when tau fibrillizes, that's the crystal structure, or it's a cryo-EM of the tau fibril. It looks almost like a celery stalk that's slightly elongated and then stacked up against each other. And it's like back to back 2 celery stalks. And like if you're looking at a like, you know, bird's eye view cross section, and so they stack into these like long celery stalks. And my strong belief is that they basically are sequestering essential proteins, and these like really essential proteins that your body, almost like nutrients for your neurons, they're getting sequestered by this like the celery stalk that's suddenly now in the middle of your neuron. And it's just like a sponge or like a black hole that's just like sequestering all these essential proteins. And so it's the loss of the soluble protein that is like causing the cognitive impairment or neurodegeneration, not the like actual just presence of these things. So anyway, that's like one kind of thing. And then the other that I think is really interesting is neuroinflammation. And like, you know, I don't know if you've ever had a concussion, but like, yeah, they suck. I like phenocopies. Like when you have 2 things that are phenotypically like very similar, like the clinical presentation is like relatively similar. I mean, this is like pseudoscientific, but it's like a way to grok these things is like a concussion. You know, you have like discombobulation, like cognitive impairment, like short-term memory loss, inability to form new memories, like it's kind of like, you know, sounds Alzheimer's like. So I think it's wrong to like therefore conclude that the underlying pathophysiology is the same, but I also don't think it's crazy to like start there.
So it's a little bit A equals B equals C sort of situation.
Yeah, kind of, right. Like, I mean, it's just like observing like basically the same thing with like 2 completely different diseases, and then just being like, well, are there clues? Yeah, is there like a kind of like underlying thing between them? And so, you know, a concussion, like, you know, symptomatically like emerges like within seconds, right? Like you get hit the concussive blow and then you like immediately feel whatever the discombobulation. And so I think that time horizon, like the fact that the temporal resolution of that is like on the order of seconds, that's a clue. And so like, what's the only thing that can like mobilize that quickly? It's probably, and like immediately cause issues at the cognitive level, it's probably inflammation. And so you have this like immediate inflammatory response, and like that's happening on the order of seconds. And so like, we know that more or less, like I'd contend that 100% of the like variance is explained by neuroinflammation in the concussion case. And it presents similarly. Like, does that port over to Alzheimer's? Like, that's a huge question mark. And like, again, I'm sure, you know,
is neuroinflammation basically a massive indicator of future onset Alzheimer's?
Well, so like inflammation seems to be long-term, which is where a lot of the like, you know, vaccine biology is like probably linked, like systemic inflammation, but neuroinflammation specifically, like for sure. And a lot of people have like tried drugging this. This is like a thing. This is a known kind of mechanism, but what percent of like the cognitive impairment is like described by specifically the neuroinflammation? That's a huge question mark. But like my pseudoscientific kind of thing here is like, maybe it's 100%.
Really?
And maybe the tau is just like a trigger for that.
So you mentioned that concussions and Alzheimer's are similar. Are you able to take anything from like concussion or research and port it over to Alzheimer's?
Yeah, that's like, in a sense, what I'm suggesting. Like, I think the clinical presentation being similar is enough to just like at least warrant investigation beyond that. And so, yeah, there are things around like resilience and like recovery rates of concussions that I think are interesting, and like definitely targets that I've seen in the Alzheimer's like omics data sets. So like, yeah, again, it's a bit of a like poor man's like, you know, estimate or like, you know, inquiry, but I think it's kind of fun to play with those like intellectually.
How many different little bits of information or indicators from all these different fields are you kind of thinking that you want to take into basically solving this one mega problem?
I think the way that I think about trying to cure Alzheimer's is just like, you need a fortress balance sheet to take as many orthogonal shots on goal as possible. And you can have a very strong prior about the biology. You're very likely to be wrong. And so to whatever extent you can absorb the blows of being wrong in the clinic, that's probably like, yeah, you just need to be wrong long enough to one day be right.
So your like success vector is effectively just creating a company that can take a bunch of hits.
Yeah, for sure. That's right. And like, and then being like super first principles about how you think about this disease, and like, again, trying to be as orthogonal in biological space as possible, but like hopefully synergistic and execution space where like the day-to-day looks very similar from like program A to program B, but in biological space, you're like hedging some of the risk.
Other than actually writing down how you're feeling and what decisions you've made, what other things do you do to basically kind of prime yourself to be able to take hits as a person? Because you're basically the company yourself. You're like the soul of the company. So how do you prime yourself to take hits?
I don't have an answer for that. I don't think I've done that well. I think I just like take them on the chin and just like sit with them, and I'm like, ouch. And
do you
then,
have
you
like
know,
days where you just lock out and then you like recover and then go back in?
I mean, I think, you know, the process of like obviously being a founder is just like getting punched in the face 1,000 times a week and just being like smiling and asking for more.
But most companies are not designed like with the understanding that you're going to have a whole bunch of failure on the road.
That's true. And like the failure, like the scale of the failure is like so grand, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you know, if we have a failure in phase 2 or even phase 3, like that could be hundreds, maybe thousands of patients and like
years of work
and like many years of work and like hundreds of millions of dollars. And like, right. Like the scale of these failures is like pretty catastrophic. So like, yeah, I can't say, you know, it's very likely that I will at some point know what that feeling looks like. I haven't had one on that scale. I think generally like we just like calibrate to whatever distribution we're kind of like presented with. So like for me, I'm probably emotionally like in terms of the responses I've had so far to the things, they may be small in absolute space, like how bad the blast radius of that thing was. But like, I'm sure the feeling will be the same when we start to like get comfortable with larger scales. But yeah, I think like, you know, there are definitely some days where I'm just like, oh, like you just get like gut punch. It's like mainly when there's like successive gut punches. And for me, it's like, it's never really lasted more than 24 hours, but like, you know, you just kind of go home that night and you're just like, I'm just going to, instead of like doing emails, I'm like, I'm just going to like watch some stupid like Netflix thing or like something like that. There's been a few times like that since starting the company of just like, you just go home, you just reset, you sleep and you wake up and it's another day.
I like will feel terrible I can feel terrible for 12 hours, like during a certain day, you know, something happens. In the rare case, like the biggest setbacks, maybe it might be a couple days, but then eventually what I would actually do is I had these moments where I would just like play video games for like 3 days straight, completely delete everything from my brain, just play a video game. And then by the third day I get bored and I'm like, got to get back at it.
100%. Yeah. Deleting inputs is so critical. I did it before Babylon. That was the first brush with like no cell phone whatsoever, cold turkey. I went 2 weeks in a very remote part of Scotland, sleeping on a like shitty mattress, like on the floor in a creaky old like cabin, chopping wood, you know, to make fire, things like this. And it was like totally life-changing because yeah, I think like, you know, when you delete your inputs, you realize that like the majority of these things that we misconstrue as thoughts are just reactions in thought space. And that process changed my worldview where I was like, wow, we're just being subliminally primed all the time in ways that we don't even realize. And when you just like drown out all the noise, you just come back with a new perspective you've never had. And that gave me actually the clarity to start Babylon. So, yeah.
What are the things that keep you up at night?
I think one thing that I've been thinking about lately that's definitely been interesting to like sit with is like, you know, are these like, it's the question I think everyone's asking that's like, you know, some like a level of AI adjacency is like, are the secular trends of like all these hyperscalers and the rate of improvement of these models, is that just like always going to exceed our ability to fine tune on top of them? Like if you're sitting at the application layer of any of these, is there even room to like actually be ahead of the curve? I'd like to think yes. But like, it's been very interesting watching these trend lines of like constantly kind of like paddling to stay like just like ahead above what everyone else is doing. And like, it probably will become a thing of diminishing returns in the future where like, you know, the rate at which you have to paddle to like, you know, stay just like ahead above like everyone else is probably like going to have to increase so much so that it becomes intractable. So like, that's one thing I think about a lot that I'm observing and trying to kind of like understand.
Have you actually experienced like this acceleration in the past 3 years, you?
For sure. Absolutely. Like I feel like everyone has felt that at some level, like emotionally. And then also because I'm like totally convinced that fine tuning will define the next decade of AI. But like, I mean, I think you're just going to see a lot less people doing that. because I think the infrastructure is also like non-obvious to support that with over on top of these LLMs. And I think other people are kind of looking around being like, well, if I'll spend all these months to like fine tune a model, and then like 3 weeks later it'll be obviated by like whatever new model comes out from OpenAI or whoever, then like what's the point? And I think that's like probably a good existential question to be asking.